girls officially become a woman when they're 12 and boys when they're 13. In the group I came from, girls did not have any celebration. That would be considered immodest. It was really clear what your role is. Women cannot be rabbis ever. Women cannot sing out loud. My son was maybe 7 and his teacher started telling him about how bad it is to look at women. From when they're like 12 or 13, they're already talking to them about the evils of masturbation. But then they're always carrying the shame. When you get your period, you go into a state of what they call it impure. During that entire time, not only are you not allowed to have sex with your husband, but you're not allowed to touch him. If you have a baby, you can't hand over the baby to him, can't sleep in the same bed as him. If you're eating a meal together, you have to put something on the table to remind yourself that you're in this impure status. There are these little special cloth white squares and swivel around to confirm that there's no blood coming. You take that piece of cloth and take it to a rabbi.
Oh.
You're doing this twice a day for 7 days. And if the rabbi determines or you find blood that's for sure blood, you have to start counting again. This was a man that I knew would never support me financially. I knew would never be a true partner to me in terms of having interests in the world, but his life would be dedicated to being a scholar. But yet I had been so brainwashed that this was kind of the best thing ever. Will I be able to make my parents proud? Will I be able to make my grandparents proud? Will I be able to look good in my role?
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you would like to come to YouTube and join in on the conversation, we would love that. You can leave your words of encouragement for our guests who are coming on and bravely sharing their stories. We love seeing how you were impacted by our videos that we post. It's so great to have such an amazing community who is willing to support. And of course, like and subscribe, all the things. So today's guest, we were connected to her. We're very grateful to have heard her story. I cannot wait to dive in more. We're going to be talking about a very specific Hasidic community, how she was raised. She's been all over the place: Toronto, New York, Israel, had 10 kids in this religion. She was married at 16. We're going to get into what that was like for her, why she decided to leave, how she was able to escape, and how she's doing now. She is a speaker, a public speaker. She did a great TEDx talk. She is now an advocate, and we're just so happy to have her on. Thank you so much for joining us, Beatrice Weber.
Hi, such a pleasure to be here with you. I do want to clarify that I got married at 18.
Oh, 18.
Yes, I was pulled out of high school at 16, but I did get married at 18.
Okay, perfect. Yes, thank you for that.
I've been all over the world.
All right. Yeah. And I feel like we have so much to get into. When you were just telling me off camera all the places that you lived, I hadn't even realized you had been so many places. So we definitely have a lot to cover. I think first, let's get into the specific community that you're a part of. This is our disclaimer for the whole video that when we are talking about the Hasidic Jewish community, we are not talking about everyone in a broad blanket statement. We are specifically talking about Beatrice and her specific experience. So if you could just maybe give an explanation of the community that you are a part of.
Yeah, thank you. And, as we were discussing off camera, even within the Hasidic community, that's a subsect of the Orthodox community, there are still so many groups within that group, and each group has its individual rules, and depending which group you're in, that depends on who you can marry and where you'll go live. So there are so many factors that even people who are Jewish Orthodox might not even understand all the little nuances. So, my grandparents were mostly Hungarian European Jews who belonged to very Orthodox communities. And then after the Holocaust, when they came to Brooklyn, this is my mother's grandparents, they really strongly associated with the Hasidic community in Williamsburg. Their children, besides for my mother, became even more Hasidic. They accepted even more stringent rules, which, we can talk about kind of what that looked like for me, what that looked like for my cousins, but really strongly associated with kind of the Hasidic Hungarian groups, where the idea of like being insular, cutting yourself off from the rest of the world was considered like top priority, even cutting yourself off from other Jews. It's only us and we need to protect ourselves. And my grandfather, when they came to Brooklyn, said, I'm going to live next to Satmar. Satmar is one of the largest Hasidic groups. And even though he was not Satmar, he's like, if I'll be next to Satmar, I'll be okay. Like they're the ones that will keep me okay. And that's how I was raised, very much with that attitude. Very much, even though I grew up in Toronto, where I was exposed to other Orthodox children because I went to school with them, it was very clear that I was not part of that, right? We had stricter rules in terms of the foods we were allowed to eat, in terms of the way I was allowed to dress. It's so true what you're saying, that there's so many nuances, and every individual person within the community that they were raised from is so different, and then each little community is different.
Yeah, let's talk about those rules, what it was like growing up in that way.
Yeah. So first of all, my mother tongue, like the language I grew up speaking, was Yiddish. I didn't know any English till I went to school. And again, there was this contrast because I was growing up in this Hasidic family where we only spoke Yiddish. But then when I went to a school that was like a Jewish Orthodox school, because there was no Hasidic schools in town, where they did speak English and the rules were a tiny little bit more lenient than those I was raised with. For instance, we had much stricter rules around the type of kosher food that we were allowed to eat, right? So there's kosher. So that meant every food had to have a certification on it. But I grew up with it needed to be more stringent. So there needed to be kind of the extra certification on it, which as a young kid, I learned from a very, very young age, I was not to take food from anybody without verifying that it had that extra level of kosher to it.
What would that extra level be? Like, give me an example of what that means.
So basic kosher is like, not mixing milk and meat, right? Buying meat from a special butcher. But then over the years, and it's even gotten even like stricter now, which I can tell you about, like even since I left, it's gotten even like more strict. But like something like potato chips or anything that's been mass produced would need to have a certification on it. So rabbis that would go down to the factory, check out that the processes are being done properly. There's nothing that would be considered suspect being put into the food. So they would kind of put a stamp on that and say, okay, this is okay.
Interesting.
And many foods that are mass produced, if you look at it, you might see like a little circle with a U inside. That means it's kosher. But the family that I grew up in, that wasn't good enough. We would need to have like rabbis who were stricter coming in and checking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what did your diet look like having all those restrictions?
It's interesting because when you grow up, that's all you know. But then you go out in the rest of the world and you're like, wow, things are very different. So even let's say we would never bake anything dairy, right? Because if you would bake a cake that's dairy, you wouldn't be able to eat it together with dinner where you're having meat, right?
Oh,
for example. You would never have anything meat for breakfast time, right? So no turkey, no nothing, because then after you eat meat, you have to wait 6 hours. So I'll say the rules are very complex, and it's amazing as young as you are because you grow up in that environment. Like you master them, you just know them, so it just becomes the way you do things, but also you're carrying all that information. And, if you ask me, the one thing I remember as a kid was so much fear, right? Because like it was all these rules, but, there was a God that demanded these rules and they had to be done in a specific way and you couldn't mess up. And I grew up where my parents were very strict in general in terms of their way of child rearing. So I was always terrified of making a mistake, but it just becomes all you know and what you know. Over the years, like the community has become even more strict, as I mentioned. Like, for instance, when I was a kid, my mother would check the lettuce because we had to check it to make sure that there were no bugs because you weren't allowed to eat any bugs, right? So there would be like an extra layer where you couldn't just buy the lettuce and rinse it off. You had to actually look at it at times through like a light box so you can see like every little leaf.
Oh,
okay? But nowadays, they don't even eat strawberries because the strawberries might have bugs in it. So we ate strawberries. And then later on, they started like washing them with soap or buying them frozen. And now they're selling like peeled strawberries in the freezer section of kosher groceries because people won't eat strawberries.
Whoa.
They won't eat broccoli. So it's like fruits and entire groups of fruits and vegetables are being cut out of people's diet. So people talk about like, so what freedom do you have now? Well, I can go to the store and buy some broccoli off the shelf. It sounds like so ridiculous, but like when you're raised with like so much vigilance, right? You're constantly in a state of hypervigilance of what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, how you're allowed to do it, and how you're not.
Yeah. So growing up for you, what would be a consequence if you ate the wrong thing or you wore the wrong thing?
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was probably about 8 years old, and I was the oldest of 8. So by the time I was 8, I probably was the oldest of 6 already by then. Wow. It was 4 girls, a boy, and then a girl. So I was 2.5, and I was a older sister of two siblings.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, I did the same. As a mother, I had the same. So it's not easy for the children, and it's not easy for the mothers.
Yeah,
it's really hard. Yeah. So I was about 8 years old, and we lived 2 blocks away from school and from a couple of stores. So for whatever reason, there was a specific popsicle color that was considered kosher enough for our standards. So one color was kosher enough. The other ones were not. So most of the people that I knew would eat all of the colors, but we were only allowed to eat one color. Okay.
What color was it?
We were allowed to eat the orange.
Okay.
It's funny because when I talk about it, and I remember like how real that felt when I was within those rules, and I remember I had my 2 younger sisters with me. So let's say I'm 8 and then 7, 6, right? So we're 3 little girls going to the corner store, and they're out of the orange popsicles. And that is devastating when you're 8 years old and it's the middle of the summer and you got a couple of dollars to buy, a popsicle for you and your 2 sisters. But they did have the yellow ones. And I was like, okay, everybody else, like, it'll be fine. So I gave them to bought 3 popsicles, and we had them, and we went to the park afterwards. And then we came home, and my younger sister told my mother.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it was very serious. I was punished by being sent downstairs and needing to recite Psalms, which we call Tehillim. We had a different word for Psalms, but it was Psalms, in order to repent, because it was considered a violation of God's will, who demanded that.
Wow.
And like the shame.
Yeah.
When you're raised being told you're special, you are the only one, you are part of a group of the only people that are going to get a reward in heaven. And you're going to get there by doing all these things. So there's the fear of being punished if you don't. Well, and then the reward of what you'll miss out on if you don't actually do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then like an additional layer of, if bad things happen today, it's your fault. God, we didn't say God. We said a different word. But a mother got cancer, which we didn't say cancer out loud, because women aren't dressing modestly enough.
Oh, wow. That's really serious.
Yeah. Like even during COVID, I still lived next to the community. Like that was the big thing, signs all over the place. Women need to dress more modestly. And my little one was in a school, and he would come home and tell me what his teachers had told him, right? And when you're told it often enough, and there's no way to disprove it, right? You believe it. So that responsibility and that fear.
That's terrifying to grow up with.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what those modesty standards were, because I think they do vary a little bit between the communities. So if we can just paint a picture of what you had to dress like.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, my mother did not become more Hasidic than her parents. She kind of stayed the same. She had siblings who stayed living in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, and they became more Hasidic. What it looked like on the outside, my mother had short hair and wore a short wig. Her sisters wore a wig and a hat on top of the wig. That was considered kind of an extra layer of modesty, that you're not only covering your hair fully, but you're wearing another layer on top of that. Another difference was my cousins started wearing full-length tights when they were 3. So at the age of 3, they were no longer wearing knee socks. Okay, they were wearing tights that went up to their waist. So I remember, being a kid, I don't know, 7 and 8, going to my cousins, and it was like, when are you going to start wearing tights? Like, that's awful, because I was still wearing knee socks. So from the age of 9, we started from the age of 9 wearing tights. So not only did we wear skirts that went below our knees, there were also, full-length tights that went over our legs all the way to our waist. Where I came from, any color was okay. There are different Hasidic groups where they have to wear specific color tights. Where I came from, any color was fine, right? So we'd wear, different colors depending on the season, or it would change based on the style. When I was a kid, the rules weren't that specific, but when I was raising my kids, there were more rules around the length of the skirts. So they would actually measure it, and it would have to be like 4 inches. I remember my daughter was actually involved in a project at school where they actually mass produce these little tape measures so the girls can measure and make sure.
So are they measuring from like the floor to the skirt, or how are they measuring?
Like the knee, like the bone of the knee ends.
Oh, okay.
And then like you need to have a certain number of inches after that.
Okay, got it.
By the time I was in high school, there wasn't yet kind of the 4-inch specific rule, but like we would be checked to make sure the length of our skirts, was long enough. And if you're rolling it up to be a little more stylish, be a little shorter, it would have to cover your knee plus.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all these rules, right? So your collarbone has to be covered. I am very aware of the fact that I have 2 little bones here because we were taught, and they actually have to be covered. So if you have your top button open, you have to make sure that it wouldn't go further down, because then you're exposing. If you had a round collar and it was a little larger, like this would be considered immodest, because you can see these collarbones. So there would be like, you would either have a safety pin where you would pull it tighter in the back, or you would actually pay somebody to stitch it down to make sure that it's fully covering your anything other than your neck. Mm. And then, of course, long sleeves. I mean, I shouldn't say, of course, for anything, because I know for a lot of people, this is like, what? What? Long sleeves. And then the color. The color of clothing was really important. No red at all. Red was considered a very immodest color. Bright yellow was considered not okay. So there were very specific rules. The boys had a different set of rules. Not that they also had rules. It was just different.
Yeah, that is very strict. Let's talk about your teen years and what that was like, because are you getting into the crushing on anybody phase? I know that the dating is not allowed, right? It's kind of an arranged marriage situation.
So the way it's so segregated, and it's so fascinating, because again, when you're in it, it's just so normal. But like from when you're 3, you're not going to school with boys, like completely separate buildings, completely separate curriculums. Like it's just such a different life, right? You're really like, men are really being, groomed and prepared for one role, and women are being groomed and prepared for another role. I know it's extremely misogynistic. I mean, I was taught as a girl that my reward to the world to come is by, making sure your husband learns and your boys go to school. Like, it was really clear what your role is. Women cannot be rabbis ever. Women cannot sing out loud ever. Like, it's so separate and like so strict, right? So let's say in the synagogue, people have some exposure to some form of orthodoxy, so they're like, oh, there was a balcony, right? It's like, no, no balcony. It's a separate room. It's a separate room, right? Sometimes, there's a window where you can see over. Sometimes, like, I've been in places where they would have like a one-way, kind of like a one-way mirror kind of thing, where the women can see the men, but the men can't see the women. There's a lot of focus for the men on staying pure and not looking at women. Okay, a ton of focus on that, like obsessively so. So women could bring us to evil, so we need to like do everything to make sure that we will never bump into a woman. Okay, that's how it's positioned. even like playing with cousins was not considered acceptable probably after 10 years old.
Oh,
Like when
wow.
you're super little, it's fine. But by the time you're 12, so girls officially become a woman when they're 12 and boys when they're 13. In the group I came from, girls did not have any celebration. That would be considered immodest. The boys had, pretty extensive public celebration. They would be celebrated on Saturday, in the synagogue. But for girls, even if like the other birthdays were celebrated with a party, sometimes like not for your 12. That was kind of like you're a woman, but to remain modest, we will not celebrate this publicly.
Wow, what did that do to you? Did that make you feel inferior to your boy siblings? Were you like, hey, what about me? I'm the oldest. Like, let's celebrate me too.
It didn't even like, I didn't know any, well, not true. Some of my friends had a little bit of a something, but it was just like so ingrained, like the different roles, right? So I'd go to the synagogue with my father. I'm a kid who liked to go. Like in retrospect, I think that it was the only time I could be alone because like, I had a bunch of siblings and there was a lot of expected of me. But if I'd go with my father to synagogue, then I could go myself to this room and I can have some peace and quiet for an hour or two during services. When I was young, my mother wouldn't come because she'd be at home taking care of the kids. So like I'd go with my father. He'd praise me for coming to shul and I would get like some quiet for a little bit. But like, I didn't think, oh, why am I not up there singing with the men? It didn't even occur to me. It was like, of course I have to go to the other room and whisper the prayers. Like, of course. I will say that I was someone, even though I was a little bit rebellious as a teenager, but still I was such a strong believer in what I was taught.
Mm-hmm.
I left the community in my 40s. Even in my 40s, I kind of left still believing a lot of what I was taught.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense because you are just completely enthralled in this community. You are shut off from the mainstream world, right? I mean, where you live, I guess I should ask first, where you live, was it very much insulated as far as you don't really go to regular grocery stores? Did you have your own stores or were you a part of the world?
So that is a great question. I grew up in Toronto, a pretty modern metropolitan city, and the Hasidic community was not very large there. So I think that's like I look back about on the power and the way they were able to do it because it wasn't like I lived in this enclave where there were only Hasidic people. There are such enclaves in the world, but that's not how I lived. I lived on a regular block with regular people. But we'd go to the park, and if a child that was not from the community would come over and want to play with us, like we just run away. We would not speak or engage. Like that was, I can't even imagine what would have happened. Like probably, I don't know. I can't even imagine what would have happened. And in my case, only when I was older did my parents start letting me kind of interact with other kids that were Orthodox and not Hasidic. But you just never had the opportunity, right? I never participated in sports or anything like that would have connected me. I did go to the library. We were allowed to go to the library. I did read some books. So it wasn't like I was completely, Laura Ingalls Wilder. So it wasn't like I didn't know that there's other such people, but it was like these things you read about in books, like not people that I could actually speak to and have a conversation with.
Mm-hmm.
I think the combination of fear and then also that's all just it works. It really works.
Yeah, fear is such a strong motivator, especially when you're a child.
I will say intergenerational Holocaust fear was very strong. We didn't talk about the Holocaust much, but you just felt it. You just felt it and you just knew it. Having large families was to make up for all those people that were killed.
Oh.
So that was kind of this extra layer. And that, of course, helped with the fear of outsiders, right? They tried to destroy us. We need to protect ourselves. We can't trust anybody.
Mm-hmm.
That was a religious belief, but it also was a very trauma reaction to what my grandparents all experienced.
Yeah, very valid response.
Valid and damaging.
Yeah.
It really, turn communities, the Hasidic community in general, and again, my family system became much more insular and fearful than they were back in Europe. For instance, the level of education, which went down drastically. Part of the reason they're able to do that is this fear, like anything outside of us is terrible, anything is bad, we can only trust ourselves. It really, in one way, is like a normal, like, yeah, that makes sense. On the other hand, what does it do to you as a society and as a whole when you live like that? Like, it's not very healthy.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't promote healing.
Yeah.
And that's why you have, all sorts of abuses happening in the community. And people are terrified of the police. I remember when I left my marriage and I called the police and they came and they're like, nobody ever calls us to this community. Like, what is going on? It's just like, we'll figure this out on our own. Outsiders will just make things worse.
Yeah. So that's something that we tend to talk about quite frequently on the show, is when you have these insulated communities and you kind of have this fear of the outside world and a lot of repression, there tends to be patterns of abuse. And you would just kind of mention that. So what are some of the things that you think are extremely prevalent because of the way that the community is set up?
I'll say first, corporal punishment, especially in schools. I mean, literally last year, New York State passed a law that you can't have corporal punishment in school in a reaction to like an expose that was done on Hasidic schools. But okay, people like to say it has gotten better. Now, what does that mean? So corporal punishment is like accepted. It's just part of what happens for the boys, not for the girls, which is interesting. In regards to sexual abuse, I know there are others that are more knowledgeable about, what goes on. I know in my family system, there was a situation where relatives came to my parents, close relatives, who did nothing. And like, it still blows my mind. It still blows my mind because so many lives have continued to be hurt because of that. My parents were highly respected members of the community, but the need to uphold your reputation as a respected member of the community means that the individual needs of a person are crushed. And there's sometimes not even an understanding that that's illegal, right? Like, you can't do that. I was always so afraid, especially with my boys, because not always, it seems to be more prevalent with boys. I was always so afraid, if they would have a tutor or anything. It was just always, boys are expected to go to the ritual baths every Friday. We should talk about the ritual bath.
Yeah, I was like, I don't think I've heard of this.
Okay, so the ritual bath, the mikvah, plays a large role in Hasidic life. So a ritual bath is like a water, I guess like a small pool, I guess. It has a lot of uses. So number one, I'll start with in some ways the weirdest, but the most benign one. If you buy dishes from a non-Jew, you need to, I guess, make them kosher. And you do that by dipping them into water. So you can do that either by the sea, if you live next to the sea, or you can do it in this ritual bath, which basically collects rainwater. My mother used to buy dishes pretty often. She was a hostess. So, you go there and dip it in. Nowadays, a lot of the household stores in neighborhoods close to Hasidic people will have that kind of ritual bath in the back of the store. So you can just buy your stuff and then just go dip, 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 and then go home. So that's one use. Another use is for humans. So Hasidic men, go often every day. And it's like a way to purify yourself. Okay, so you're kind of dipping into this bath. For men, it's public. So it's kind of like this public space where you just go in together with whoever's there. Children, young boys, including my brothers and my children, would go on Friday with their fathers or without their fathers, but that would be considered just an expectation. So these people are completely nude, going in the water, and there's kids there too. I will say, to my ex-husband's credit, he was always afraid. So he didn't want to take the boys when they were too little. So he only took them out when they got older. But they had to go, you know. Then the final use of the ritual bath, which you only find out about when you're ready to get married, is women use the ritual bath in a more secret way. And they use the ritual bath as part of the menstrual, impure, pure cycle, which I can talk about, which I will say so many people in the community and even outside the community like to turn it into something beautiful. And it's abusive on so many levels. And, you know, I was watching, I forgot which documentary, the FLDS, sweet child, sweet something.
Keep sweet, pray, and obey.
Yeah. And, you know, I watch these things and they're very triggering. But then I, you know, look at all kind of the sexual stuff and I'm like, we had none of that. Like, and then I'm like, whoa, 1 second. Like this whole, you know, you don't hear it. Nobody talks about it until you're engaged. And then you have a special teacher who teaches you. There's no sex ed anywhere. So I was, you know, 18, and I can talk about how I, you know, was matched up. And then you're 18, no sex ed, never had a boyfriend, nothing, you know, and then all of a sudden you're given all this information and another whole set of rules. So I guess going back to what we were talking about before, like what my teenage years were like, I mentioned how separate everything was. But as I became a teenager, I was very angry about how I was restricted more than everybody else. So I went to a movie once, which was like completely out of line, going to a movie. And I never had a boyfriend, but pretended that I knew some boys and talked to some boys, because that was kind of, you know, my parents freaked out and had no idea what to do with me. Like no idea, because I was a very obedient child. You know, again, they had this reputation in the community. My mother was a teacher, a principal, highly respected in the school. My father was very charitable, you know. And when I was 16, they said, okay, we're moving. We're moving. And we moved to a city up in Rockland County in New York State that had a much larger Hasidic community. And you are going to a religious seminary in Northern England until you behave. And I remember going to the school principal and like, I love to learn, I still do, and was like begging him, please, I stay. Like I'll board by somebody, I'll find something, like I really want to stay. But the whole thing was, so my parents, you know, they spoke to him beforehand. Of course he wasn't going to say yes, you know. But like, the more I think about it, the more like, I can't believe it. Like, did nobody see what was going on? Did nobody see that I just wanted to finish school? So I was sent to a seminary and told I can only come back if I behave. I hated it there. It was awful. Talk about rules. I don't know. Within the first week, there's this piece of paper going around that people are passing one to each other, the new girls. It's 150 girls coming in the first year, and then it got a little smaller over the years. So it was a 3-year program in a small village in Northern England. So us new people, 150 people, there's this paper being passed around. So you open the paper, it says, the way you're currently opening your pads is not allowed on Saturday, on Shabbat. That's a forbidden way of opening it. And there's a new way, a different way that you have to open it. It's like, whoa, okay. And like, we were all coming from super religious homes. Like, it wasn't like we needed to be educated, but in retrospect, it was almost like, we're going to find places where you don't do things stringently enough, and we're going to make sure that you do. You know, it's like this manipulation and control. And my gosh, it was like this classroom, 150 girls, a guy teacher sitting on top on this podium. I mean, it was, and one of the rabbis there was the one that wrote a full book, a textbook on the rules of modesty, complete with diagrams of like the neckline, the elbow, where on the elbow. It's like a full textbook. And it's like, what motivates somebody, to devote their life, their energy? And people take it as the word of God. That's what they take it as, the word of God.
Do you think the purpose of all of these rules and the control down to that level is just to keep you so in your brain of checking off the things that you have to do, so you can't even consider questioning or
Can't
ask?
think of anything else.
Yeah, you're just so focused on not messing up that you can't even allow your intuition or original thought to come into your head.
Yeah, even more so. I was pretty interested in theology, I would say, relatively speaking to other people. But for the most part, there isn't really a discussion of theology. I mean, less time for it. And more so, nobody really cares what you believe. As long as you are doing the things you need to do and portray yourself as observant in the community, you're okay. It definitely keeps you busy. There's so busy. Like, one of the challenges that I have now is being okay with just resting, with just slowing down, because when you have all these million rules, you don't even have a chance to tune into yourself, to think about what you want, to have dreams. Some people, when they leave the community, they like think back about what dreams did they have when they were younger, when they leave, right, these very, controlled spaces. But like, I didn't even have time to think about what I wanted to be. Like it was just, I was being prepared to be a wife. That was it.
Yeah.
If I cooked something well, it was like, oh, great. We'll tell the matchmaker, like, in a joke. I don't think they really told the matchmaker, but it was like, oh, this will make you a better wife,
Yeah.
because you can cook, because you can do this. But also, if you are in such levels of fear about all of these details, do you even have the opportunity to think about leaving, to think about the bigger picture? There's so much shame. I'll say also with the boys, from a very young age, they talk about not looking at women. My son was maybe 7, and his teacher started telling him about, how bad it is to look at women. From when they're like 12 or 13, they're already talking to them about the evils of masturbation. And they're humans. They're all sometimes going to, right? But then they're always carrying the shame. And there are people in the community who will be like, oh, whatever, and just like live their life. But most people will live with tremendous fear and obedience. So they're never going to question the authority if they're so busy being ashamed, believing that they're, violating some big rule of God. Like, how will they even have the energy and resources?
So how long were you at seminary before you were allowed to come back?
So after I hated it, it was like this old coal mining city in northern England. It was just terrible. So after a year, I was like,
A
I
year?
promise I'll do whatever. I'll behave. I promise. Then they let me come back. And, soon after that, that's when my parents started listening to suggestions. Because I came from a wealthy family and we had good lineage. That's like a big deal in the community I come from. Your lineage is huge if you can trace back to a couple of rabbis. And then I will say my ancestry, DNA test shows that I am 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. So my bloodline is clean, whatever. That means, it's a big deal in the community. If you're like a convert, or you're somebody whose parents or grandparents kind of went off and then you came back yourself to observance, you're a suspect. It's a big deal. That kind of informal caste system is a big deal. So because we had this good lineage and my father had become wealthy, I was very sought after as a woman, young, not woman, girl.
So when did people start coming forward on you or start talking to your parents?
I was 17 when I met the first person. Yeah.
Okay, because you had mentioned before in our phone call that you were pulled out of school at 16 to start preparing to be a wife. So how did that work?
So I went to seminary for that year.
Okay.
When I was 16, I was in England. And then
Got it.
as soon as I got back, that's when the phone calls started coming. right? Oh,
Got
she's
it.
back. Like, great. So it was like a couple of times a week, there'd be another matchmaker calling up with a suggestion, this person, that person. And
Yeah.
my parents had the pick of like who to say. My mother made it very clear to me. She would not tell me who was being suggested until they had cleared it and decided that it was okay for me to, meet this person.
Yeah. So get us into your head because I'm wondering if it was a situation where you're excited because you were so segregated your whole life from boys, men, the whole thing, and now you're actually being able to talk to them in some sort of controlled way, or was it like, I don't want anything to do with these guys, stay away from me?
I'll say there was a lot of fear. The excitement wasn't so much that I'll finally be able to be with a boy, but the excitement was, will I be able to score the one that I'll be able to, I did it, you know, I did what I was supposed to do. I was successful at, like now in retrospect, at this game, essentially, right? Making
Oh.
sure my reputation was clean. I come from this good family. Like, will I make it? And it's, when I left my marriage, my children were of marriageable age, and many of the older ones were really upset that I left. And part of it was, if you're divorced, you go down in status. So all of a
Mm.
sudden, the people you're being suggested are going to be lower in status. Once you leave and you look at it, it's all. I mean, to me, I look at it, it's all a joke. Like, what does that even mean? Higher status, lower status? Like, that your grandfather was a rabbi or not a rabbi? Like, who cares? But when you're in it, it feels really real. So I would say that was my, like, will I be able to make my parents proud? Will I be able to make my grandparents proud? Will I be able to look good in my role? That was my main thought, which is like so sad, but that's what I was raised to do. That's what mattered. That's what mattered.
Yeah. Well, this was the moment. This was the climax of
Yeah.
your purpose is finding the right guy and being worthy enough to, like you said, make your parents proud. So can you walk us through that process, what it was like, what happened when you finally saw the man who would become your husband, everything that you went through?
Yeah. So in different Hasidic groups, it's a little different. But the Hasidic group I came from, I met with him a handful of times. So always at a dining room table, opposite sides of a dining room table, for about an hour each time. So the first time I met, it was at, oh, no, before that, I have to step back. Before that, his parents came to meet me and my parents. He was studying in Israel. His mother came to check me out, to make sure that I was worthy enough of meeting her son. And my future father-in-law came to discuss the dowry. Okay. That was kind of for my parents, it was also a huge like accomplishment, right? My father was going to get a son-in-law who would be a scholar, and my father would support him. That was like considered a status in this subsect of the Hasidic community I came from. Not in all, but in this one, that was like, wow, like I'm able to do that financially, and we can get this person, like we can get somebody like that. So I was kind of like a little bit like a meat market, It was like, how much can you give? And there was negotiations, and it ended up being a house, a fully paid off house, and support for at least 5 years.
Whoa.
So it's kind of sold for that. Yeah.
Wow, that's a really big deal.
They wouldn't have brought him back if not for that, right? Because he was considered a future up and coming scholar. So it was like, this is what I deserve. That had to be cleared up before everything. Hands had to be shaken, and that had to be cleared up. Once that was okay, then he came in from Israel. He had been studying in Israel, so he came in. First time we met was at my aunt's apartment. So my house was a busy house. I was the oldest of 8, people coming in and out. The idea was, the neighbors would see. The idea was, if I meet at my aunt's house, who lived in Brooklyn, nobody would know. Let's start there.
Okay, so then what happened?
It was I'll just say it was terrifying. There was nothing about it that felt normal or comfortable. So first of all, even though I had been raised speaking Yiddish, for most of my life, I spoke English. I went to school where we spoke English. My parents kind of started speaking English. So even though, I still understand, even till this day, I speak Yiddish and understand Yiddish, that was not conversationally the language I spoke all the time. But he barely spoke English.
Mm.
He barely spoke English. So it was number one, me, and I was speaking in Yiddish to him. So I was speaking in a language that I was not very comfortable in. And also somebody who, I had this whole pressure of I have to look good here, right? Because like, will I be worthy? And like in retrospect, it's so funny. This was a man that I knew would never support me financially. I knew would never be like a true partner to me in terms of having interests in the world, but his life would be dedicated to being a scholar. But yet I had been so brainwashed, for lack of a better word, that this was kind of the best thing ever, that I was just like, can I do this? So the conversation was extremely uncomfortable. And I think that's pretty normal in these situations.
Mm-hmm.
So in other sects, people will meet in a hotel lounge. In other sects, people might meet for a few months. In other sects, it's like you meet for 20 minutes and then you get engaged. So in all sects, you're meeting the person beforehand. So it's never like you meet somebody at the day that you get married. You're always like officially have some sort of meeting. So we were kind of in the space where it was like, okay, you could have 2 or 3 meetings and then you decide, but it wasn't, it's like it's not a fair position to put somebody in. Never mind an 18-year-old kid. Like, it's not really a choice. I couldn't have said no. I could not have said no. So we're 4 girls first, and my 4th sister, she put up a big fuss when it came to her turn. And she would, she'd meet somebody and she'd be like, no. And my father would be like yelling, what do you mean? There's nothing wrong with him. Meet with him again. And she's like, never, no. So she like fought a lot. And in the end, they found her somebody from Europe who was clean shaven and actually went to work. He's my only brother-in-law that actually had a professional job. So, and years later, she told me, I didn't want to end up with someone like you did. But I, at 18, had just been like so traumatized, right? Sent away for not behaving, was so afraid of like being banished again that I was just like, okay, you know what? He doesn't seem that bad.
So how long before you got engaged?
Oh, like, I don't know, a couple of days.
Oh, okay. So you meet him. You're like, okay, this is the guy. I found someone of high status. The hands have been shaken. I already know that he's going to get, or we're going to get this house and he's going to be supported. And now we're engaged and you barely know him.
Yeah. And he travels back to Israel. Technically, you're not supposed to have any contact while you're engaged. I found out later my mother pushed for him to call me once in 2 weeks. So we spoke once in 2 weeks for like 10 minutes. And then when he came back, we got married.
Okay, so I'm going to circle us all the way back to the bath because I feel like you were about to tell us a story.
Yes.
And then we got sidetracked. So you find out you're engaged. Now it's like, here's all the sex education. What does that actually consist of?
So just to be clear, there's very little sex education and there's a lot of rules.
Okay.
So there's a whole bundle of rules that's actually a very essential part of Orthodox and Hasidic Judaism that you don't talk about while you're a kid. So when you get your period, you go into a state of what they call it impure, and you remain that way until you go to the ritual bath. Now, that's a minimum of 2 weeks. So first, you get your period, you finish your period, then you have to count 7 days, and then you go to this ritual bath. During that entire time, not only are you not allowed to have sex with your husband, but you're not allowed to touch him. If you have a baby, you can't hand over the baby to him. You can't sleep in the same bed as him. If you're eating a meal together, you have to put something on the table to remind yourself that you're in this impure status. He's not allowed to see you, like you have to be completely dressed in front of him. Like he's not allowed to see your hair. He's not allowed to see your elbow, basically. You become like as if you're not married to him, like all those rules. During that time, so you get your period, then you have to verify that it stopped. So I just want to, you get these little cloth, there's these little special cloth squares, white squares, that you need to, I'm sorry for being so like explicit, that you need to put deep into your vagina and swivel around to confirm that there's no blood coming.
Wow.
And if you're not sure, because you're finding something yellowish, orangish, you take that piece of cloth and take it to a rabbi.
Oh, that's uncomfy.
It's creepy. And also, you're wearing white underwear those 7 days. And if you find some color on the white underwear and you're like, is this blood? Isn't this blood? You're going to the rabbi. You're doing this twice a day for 7 days. And if the rabbi determines or you find blood that's for sure blood, you have to start counting again. And again, you know nothing about this. So you're going to this teacher who's telling you what sex is for the very first time, and then being like, okay, then there's all this. I'm just going to finish kind of what that whole process looks like, and then we'll talk about what those classes look like. So after the 7th day, and you kind of made it through the 7 days, then you have to prepare to go to the ritual bath. Now, part of going to the ritual bath is that you have to make sure that your entire body is covered in water. So you can't have anything that blocks. So you have to spend a minimum of an hour, I think it was an hour and a half, cleaning yourself ahead of going into this ritual bath.
Oh, wow.
So meaning you have to cut your nails perfectly. If you have nail polish, you have to remove the nail polish. It's just that if you have a scab, you have to make sure there's no hardness around the scab. I mean, talk about new rules, but this is your life as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So these are just the rule. This is what you have to do. You're a married woman. Here you go. This is what you need to do. There was no mention of consent at all during this whole 12 session lesson. And some people go to group sessions. I went to private sessions, which was considered like more, special, whatever. No question of consent at all. Nothing. On the contrary, I was taught, well, first of all, you have to go mikvah night, meaning the night that you go to the ritual bath, you have to have sex. Like it's not an option for you. And you have to be available for your husband, period. You're not taught about birth control. You're not taught that as an option or a possibility, And sure enough, I got pregnant a month after I got married.
Wow. So do they explain to you the process or why you bleed or how babies are made, or it's just this is what you have to do?
Yeah, I mean, this is what you need to do. By then, I kind of figured out that that's how babies are made. But I was a little confused about male anatomy, I will say that. My mother had told me about getting my period earlier on. It was a funny story, but some girls in my class had put the word sex on the door, and I had no idea what it was. And when they saw me, they were like, "Oh, take it away. She shouldn't see it. She's going to tell on us," right? Because I was kind of the more religious of them. And I came home. I was so embarrassed that they kind of treated me like that. I came home crying hysterically.
Aww.
And my mother's like, I didn't have a chance to tell her like what they had done. And she just sat me down and was like, "Oh, I need to tell you about this. Like, this is what's going to happen to your body. And when you're pregnant, it's not going to happen."
Interesting.
That was like kind of the only allusion to that there's a connection between your period and pregnancy.
Okay.
But I kind of put it together at some point. By the time you're being taught that, yes, I think that that's going to make you pregnant, that having sex will make you pregnant. There's a certain like relief when you're pregnant because then you don't have to go to the ritual bath every month, right? And you don't have to do the whole thing. So there's definitely that. Though I will say for me, especially when things really started getting hard in my marriage and I felt like I needed to put some boundaries, not going to the ritual bath was kind of a way to have my privacy and be like, "You can't touch me now," which I was lucky in that way because you have some men from the community that wouldn't respect that and would be like, I don't care. But he did, though I was called, and I actually spoke to a rabbi beforehand and he gave me permission not to go to the ritual bath. But, my ex was like, you're a moredet, which means a rebellious woman, like you need to be doing this.
So were there any rules around being able to or not being able to have sex while you were pregnant?
No. I mean, there were rules in general, right? And my ex-husband in particular had a lot of kind of extra rules. He really bought into all the rules he was taught and like expounded on them. So for him, it was like only in a certain position, only missionary, only when it's pitch dark, only late at night. There was like a whole, and this was my relationship with him, that he personally, over and above the fact that we come from this community, he personally was a very controlling and manipulative person. So there was a lot of him, especially at the beginning of my marriage, a lot of kind of pushing me away, and then me, like, the only way he would ever like even look at me was when we have sex. So I was trying to get him to come closer to me, and he'd be like, well, I'm a scholar and scholars are supposed to have sex less. But then of course when I stopped doing that, he got upset. So it was there were aspects to that were manipulative in ways over and above what, like, the religious part of it. He was just his own, with his own issues. But I blame what he was taught and how he was taught as a man. He was a very smart kid, grandchild of rabbis. And from when he was little, he was kind of put on this pedestal and told, you're going to be a great rabbi. You're amazing. Basically, the world was created for you, like everybody bow down to you. And he had the kind of personality that was like,
okay,
I think so. This works. And I got sucked into that. I very much got sucked into that. And it took me many, many years for me to even be willing to see that. I started therapy when I was married for 15 years. It took me a year and a half of therapy until I was like, I went there because I was depressed. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm depressed, blah, blah, blah. It took me a year and a half to be like, oh my gosh, this is a really bad marriage. Like, this is really bad. And that kind of started my journey.
Wow. Okay. I need to rewind. 10 children. Beatrice, how did you do that? How in the world? Because I'm also curious. You said that your husband didn't work. I'm trying to figure out how. What?
Yeah. So financially, mostly my parents supported us. At different times, he would be learning, they call it learning, the studying, the word that's used is learning. He'd be learning in spaces where they would give him stipends. So at different times, he would be bringing in different stipends, but mostly it was my parents supporting us. So we moved to Israel. We lived in their apartment rent-free. They sent us a check. I should rephrase that. They sent him a check every month. So mostly my parents were supporting us.
Okay.
Like some of his friends, like their wives worked really hard. I only started working much, much later on. Some of them, their wives would like have play groups at home. They'd babysit. They'd do wigs. So that's like a business in the community, right? Because everyone wears wigs. Okay. So I actually shaved my head for 20 years. Not everybody shaves their head, but I did. And then you cover your hair with a wig. So that's like a business some of the women do, where they kind of sell you the wigs and then they style the wigs. So that would be like a business. But I learned how to stretch food really far. I sewed clothing. If I wanted my kids to have nice clothing for an upcoming holiday, I sat down and sewed it for them. So wow. I look now at how I live now with my 2 younger children, and it's like these kids have like no idea. I'd cook a big meal, for a Saturday for Shabbos. So I'd have this big chicken soup, and then we'd be eating it on Sunday night. And then for the next night, I'd be taking the bones off the chicken and like making it. So I definitely knew how to stretch a dollar and make it work. But we did get financially supported by my parents. We couldn't have done it otherwise. There was no, that would have been almost impossible. And in regards to having so many children, I will say that I had a lot of energy and few outlets for that energy, right? It wasn't going to work, especially when I lived in Israel, but like working was not an option for me. Going to college was not an option for me. So all my energy went to my family and my children. And getting permission to go on birth control, you needed to get permission, was an ordeal. And people ask me, were you never on birth control? I was like, yes, I was. I would have had more children if I was not. So I definitely was on birth control. But you had to go to a rabbi and you had to get permission and you had to explain why you want permission. It wasn't like, well, I have 5 kids, 6 kids, and I'm 25, It was like, why? And this is where the dynamic between me and my ex-husband that was really toxic came into play. I got pregnant with my seventh probably child, and he didn't talk to me because he was upset. But he didn't want to go to a rabbi to ask for permission not to go on birth control, because that was not appropriate. He felt for him to do that. He wanted me to go crying to a rabbi and tell the rabbi that I can't cope anymore and I'm not managing and I need help. So after I had that baby, that's what I did. It's so demeaning for me to have to go to a rabbi and be like, I'm not coping, I'm not managing, I need help. Like, why does a woman who has 7 kids need to do that? Like, I gave my contribution to the world, like to the Jewish community, but it's not enough. It's the control all over. And and some people will say, well, I just went on birth control myself. I didn't care. But I wasn't like that. I was very much a believer. I very much want to do what's right. And I was solely focused on having these children. But when I think about some of the responsibilities that I put on my older children, especially my oldest daughter, like, it wasn't fair. I look at my 11-year-old kid now, that he's just like, she was like 10. And I remember her like helping me fold like piles of laundry. Try to imagine the laundry, right? Piles of laundry. Like, it's not fair for little children. But that's what happens with these large families. You just end up relying on these children. And I remember I just started going for therapy. So that was like my first like breakout rebellious thing that I went for therapy, right? And I remember my ex-husband would, if the kitchen wasn't left clean, he'd like blame her and be like, why didn't you clean it? She's like 12 years old. Why didn't you clean the kitchen? Why is it like this? And I remember having conversations with her that you are only responsible to do what I tell you to do. You don't have to worry about anything else. So, me going to therapy, even though I wasn't questioning the faith or anything like that, it took years for that to happen, just helped me enough with some boundaries and wrongs and rights that I was able to help my older children a little bit. But it's also, there are certain practices that are normal in these communities. Like, it's normal to send little children to play outside and just trust that things will be okay. It's normal. I don't know, there's a certain amount of neglect that's just considered normal that just happens as part of it.
Yeah. Do you remember how old you were when you had your 10th child, just so I can get an idea of how quickly?
Most of my kids were born in my 20s.
Whoa.
So I had my first one when I was 19, right? I got pregnant a month after I got married. We moved to Israel like 3 weeks later. So I moved to Israel in the spring. Like, I got married in the winter. In February, we moved right after Passover in April. And then she was born in October. I was like, oh my gosh. I had no idea what hit me. And like, yeah, of course not. And then I got pregnant 3 months later. So I was like a baby. I was a baby. In some ways, I felt also like I'm winning at this. I'm winning at this. Right? They were beautiful children. This is me showing the world, showing my parents, showing everybody that I got this. Like, I can do this, right? And then plus I'm cooking and baking and preparing all these meals. By the time we moved back to the United States, I was 29, right? We had lived there 11 years. I was 29, I had 7 kids.
Whew. I'm just trying to imagine. I only have one 4-month-old, and I'm just like, oh, this is so hard. I'm not doing near the work that you were doing.
I look back, just remembering an incident where my baby's like, my oldest is like that age, right? Like 4 months old, 5 months old. It's the holiday of Purim. So Purim is a holiday that happens a month before Passover, where it's recommended to drink. Just the men. The men drink a lot, and the women cook and bake, and you give like food baskets to each other, and then there's a big meal at the end. So I'll never forget. I'm pregnant already. I'm 19. I have 1 baby. I'm pregnant, and I'm like standing on my feet for hours baking these like miniature cookies to like give out to my friends and neighbors. I'm like, I didn't for a moment think, what do I need? what do I want? What works?
Mm-hmm.
None of that. It was just like, what do I need to do next to keep this going? And I'm grateful. It took a lot of steps. I'm a little stubborn. Like, it took a lot of steps for me to come to where I am today and to see things for what they were. It was oppressive. It was abusive. It was controlling. My best years of my life were squeezed out of me for the sake of a specific community, family system, and man. And again, my children are beautiful and I love them, even though, most of them are not in my life now. I have no regrets. How can you have regrets for having children? Like, they're my children. When I look back at this whole, systemic way of looking at it, like, it was terrible. It was cruel and evil.
When did you start to realize the level of control manipulation, or did you? What was it that made you think, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned therapy. Is that when you really started opening your eyes and realizing you needed to get out?
So in therapy, it took me a while, but I started realizing what my marriage was like, right? Because I had been very much like, I'm married to a scholar, I'm married to a Torah scholar. That's amazing. I'm so lucky. I'm going to go straight up to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. I just have to be better, do more, and things will be great, right? Very typical of I was a classic, I don't know, I think they call it like battered women syndrome. Like, I was a classic woman who was in this situation, wholeheartedly believed he was amazing. I had a problem. I'd fix it. Things would be better. But that unpeeled. I remember it started unpeeling when my therapist recommended that I start tapping into how I feel. And I remember when I allowed myself to feel angry at him for the first time.
Ooh.
And it was like, oh, wow. Because he did like really mean things. Like, for instance, financially, he controlled the money so much. It wasn't even his money. It was like, he'd like say, no, I need new shoes for the kids. He'd say no. And then like, he'd go buy something else, like things like that. Like he was just a really not nice person, for lack of a better word. And he was respected in the community because of his scholarship. And I never told anybody, because who's going to believe me anyway? And my job was to be a good wife. So that was like the first window. But that led me to be like, what would I like to do with my life? What are my options? And I started going to college. I did go to a college program that was designed for the community. So it was like part of a larger network of colleges, but they had like one site where they had separate days for women, separate days for men, where it accommodated the holidays. So it was very much within, but it still gave me a college degree. And I started working. Again, it was working in the community at a nonprofit social service agency, very much in the community. But I was working and I was getting a paycheck and I opened my own bank account. Like, I had a little bit of agency. I'll just say this. There's nothing more powerful than a woman getting a job and going to college. Like, it gives you power. And, when I started realizing what was going on with my marriage, my first thing was, there's no way I could stay with this. Like, there is no way. Shortly before I went to therapy, I had a miscarriage when I was in Toronto with my parents. And that kind of set me off. And my ex-husband refused to call the doctor, even though I was like hemorrhaging. So it was because it was Saturday. So I called myself, and then I had to go to the hospital myself because he refused to come in the car. And then he, at that point, refused to drive because like it didn't befit somebody of his like scholarly level. So like a week later, I'm driving everybody back home. We had just moved homes, and he wouldn't go to like a store like Home Depot to buy stuff because it wasn't like appropriate for him. So I was running. At that point, I had 8 kids, and it was just like all fell apart, and I got super depressed and was super scared because I was feeling suicidal. And like I didn't connect that really. I don't think it was just like, I have to do something. Like I can't, not bouncing back. That's when I started therapy. So that kind of set off where I was like, whoa, this is really bad. Like, this is not okay. And, I was terrified to leave. How am I going to leave this marriage? What am I going to do? Of course, my parents were like, there's no way. They'd give me money every now and then, my own money, whatever. I got him to go to marriage counseling a couple of times, which was like a miracle. But he was really scared. He didn't want me to leave. But he couldn't change. There was no way. And then I remember when I said, listen, it was like our 3rd bout of marriage counseling. I was like, I can't, there's no way. Like, we're going to have to get divorced. And he said to me, if you leave, you'll never see any of the children again. And at first I was like, would he really do that? But then I had like my kid who was at that point studying out of town calling me up and saying, I hear what you're doing. I'm never going to invite you to my wedding. I was like, oh my gosh, he's starting to talk to the kids. Like, this is getting really nasty and bad. Ultimately, when I left my marriage, it was in the middle of the night with the 4 younger kids. And I, in my mind, thought, I'm just going away for the holiday. Rabbis had gotten involved and they were like, you should go away for the holiday with your kids. There's too much pressure at home. But he didn't let me. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can leave. And my plan was just for the holiday. But after I was gone for a few hours, I was like, I am not going back. I didn't take my phone. I didn't take my own car because I was scared he would track me, take the kids away from me. But I left with the 4 kids and managed to keep them with me.
Wow. Yeah, you talk about this in your TED Talk, and I think it was really interesting. If you wouldn't mind sharing the very specific way that you would plan to show up at your brother's house so that you could stay.
Yeah, right. Because I wasn't sure where my family would stand on this. And there was a part of me that felt like when I really show them that I'm leaving, then they'll support me. Like maybe, okay, now they don't want to support me, but maybe then they'll support me. But I wasn't sure. And I was worried that if I'd arrived to my brother, in the afternoon, he'd make a call and tell my ex-husband, guess what, who just arrived? And then he'd come and he'd tell my kids to go home with him, and they would be so scared. They would say yes. And then what would I do? Then I would have left without my kids. And I was not want to do whatever I could to prevent that. But yeah, so I timed it so that I should arrive at his house like 2 minutes before the holiday started, because like the rules are so strict that no matter what he felt, once the holiday would start, right, you'd light the candles and the holiday starts, nobody is picking up the phone. So that gave me 2 days at his house where nobody was looking for me. Nobody, like, I was safe. And, after nightfall, after the second night, then like his phone started ringing nonstop. They were trying to figure out where I was. I didn't know what to do. I was not planning on going to court at all. That was like kind of not my thing. But then I realized like, oh my gosh, they're going to come take the kids. Like my brother was like, I can't protect you. Like he'd get like angry. Like I was like, I need some court protection here. Like if I don't get protection from the court, I'm never going to see these kids again.
Yeah.
I want to be clear. Throughout this time, I was still part of the community. Dressed with my short little shaitel wig, my long skirt, my legs fully covered, my arms, completely part of the community. It was not, my intention was to leave my marriage and not the community. It was not. I never imagined. Even though immediately my ex tried to portray me as somebody who wanted to leave the community, said I was a member of Footsteps, which is an organization that supports people to leave. But it was not true. I was very, very much observant and part of the community.
Wow, there's so much of your story that I know just from talking to you off camera that we haven't even gotten into. We definitely need to do a second episode. So we'll leave it on this cliffhanger here of what happened when the phone started ringing and now your soon-to-be ex-husband would be coming after you and the kids. Let's get into this in the next episode. But for now, we need a Linda Listen moment, sassy statement as the viral video with the toddler goes, or something inspirational, up to you.
Okay. Linda says, you are the owner of yourself. You get to make choices that work for you, no matter where you come from, no matter where you were born, and no matter what you were told.
Amazing. I love that so much. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your story. I cannot wait to get into the rest of it. But for now, where can people find you, your social media, your website, or any organizations that you want to talk about, which we can also talk about in the next episode too?
I have a website, beatriceweber.com, just my name, first and last name. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, all the spaces as Beatrice Weber. So you can find me there, and I just started a Substack, so you can find me on Substack too. I've written some essays and stuff like that, so excited about that.
Awesome.
I'd also like to make a plug for the organization that advocates for children to get an education, and we'll talk more about that, on the next episode, yafed.org. So that's an organization that I'm very closely involved with that's doing excellent work on behalf of the children who are still in the community.
Great. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
Just want to say, like, every time I go back to my story, it's it's a reminder, I guess, to myself of how many people are still stuck in these situations. It's a lot. It's a lot to be
Yeah.
part of these high control communities, and how many people, remain impacted, and how hard it is to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, you're definitely an inspiration. I've listened to some of your talks, and guys, hire her. She's great for a motivational speaker. You can find more of that on her website. And yeah, this has been awesome. Leave those comments down below. If you want to support the podcast even further, becoming a patron is a way you could do that. Patreon.com/cults to consciousness. Our newest patrons, Janine, Claudia, and Krista, thank you so much for your support. And we do have some merch at cultstoconsciousness.com under the merch tab. If you like this video, I'll link 2 more down here below. You're definitely going to want to check out the one we did with Javi. It's our top performing video. I think it has over 1 million views now. You'll want to check that one out after this, and then obviously part 2 when it comes out. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, to be conscious and be well.